Hello again. Welcome to the third lecture in our course on Prajnaparamita. Today, I'm going to just look at the actual sutra, the 8,000-line sutra itself, and walk you through a few bits of that sutra just to show you one of the ways in which you can read a Prajnaparamita Sutra, and also by reading it to maybe understand a little bit better what it's about. In the process of doing this, I'm also going to be suggesting that perhaps there is a structure in the sutra, or structures even, plural, and that any of you who would like to take the English translation or the Chinese and look for any structures that you can find, I would be most appreciative and would enjoy hearing what you find. We're going to go to the first two lines of the sutra that you see there. This is the 8,000-line version in the Chinese, translated by Dr. Osborne and myself for the Numata Translation Series in Tokyo. It's the translation done by Kumarajiva, very famous translator. And we're going to just look at a translation of his translation and try to see the significance, if we can, of what's written there. This sutra has a preamble. This preamble is quite similar to the preamble found on many Mahayana sutras. The preamble tells us when, where was it given, who was there. The preamble is so similar between all the sutras that, in general, it's felt that the redactors used a set preamble, and they used it to put in the beginning of sutras with only minor variations. The sutra begins in the preamble with those famous words, "Thus it was heard by me," or "This is what I heard," or "This I heard," meaning that the speaker is Ananda and that it's the remembered words. So it implies that this text was originally oral, although we're looking at a redaction. That is, we're looking at a printed, written version of it. So this I heard. This is what I heard. At a time, I've translated it at a time. They didn't mean to say once upon a time or sometime or other. They meant a specific instance when this particular text was being spoken. So at a time, when the Buddha dwelt on Mount Grithakuta near the city of Rajagriha. I've shown you the map. Rajgir is in the Ganges basin, Nearby is the famous Nalanda. Also nearby is Gaya, where the Buddha first had his enlightenment experience. Grita Kuta, is translated, Grita means vulture. Kuta means peak. When I went there, my first trip, as you can see from the picture, it's not a high mountain. It's more like a hill. Unfortunately, the rainforest that once was there has been cut down long ago, with the result that it's dry and a lot of the time dry and hot to walk out there. And the peak now is barren of anything except a few remains of what was once a monastery on top of it. Why'd they call it Vulture Peak? If we look at the role of the vulture in the culture of the subcontinent, the vulture, as it was in Tibet, the vulture was a scavenger, and the scavenger was encouraged to eat the dead bodies. If you were an elite, you would be perhaps cremated, your body burned. It meant that you had to have enough money to gather the fuel to make the cremation possible. And then what you would have left would be the relics, the bones, teeth, things that didn't burn. But for just an ordinary person, they didn't even bury them underground. Instead, they did exposure. And exposure means that the body is left, particularly for birds, and in particular vultures, to come and eat it, to clean it up. Death is polluting, so you want to get rid of it as soon as you can. There's no better way to get rid of the dead body than to expose it where there are many vultures, and in a very short period of time, a dozen or 24 or even 100 vultures can eat a body shortly. We see this in Tibet with the sky burials. Sky burials are at places near where vultures are, and the vultures come and quickly devour a body. And people even break up the bones, and the vultures eat the bones. And when that's done, the birds fly up into the sky and circle the site. In other words, symbolically, the loved one has now been taken up to heaven by the birds. And the soaring birds above give the people a happy moment, a joyful moment that the earthly remains are gone. So I think the Buddha went out to where the vultures in what's called charnel fields, where the bodies are laid. It's similar to Gaya. Gaya was also a place of the dead. His enlightenment experience led him, as we've said, led him to Gaya. And there at Gaya, he had his enlightenment experience under that huge banyan tree. So when he taught this material on the emptiness of everything, he went out to Vulture Peak to do it. So this is why I think the peak was so important. It's no longer used for that purpose. The vultures are gone. No bodies are exposed around it. But the memories of what once probably went on there is still with us. Next, the preamble tells us that the Buddha was there on Gritakuta together with the great Sangha. I use Sangha because the Chinese does not translate the word. It reproduces the sound. The Sangha of bhikshus, monks. And at this particular time, there were 1,250 of them in total there on Gritakuta Peak with the Buddha. It's a large number, a large community. I'm never sure what these numbers mean in ancient texts. People can use a number to indicate a few, or they use other numbers to indicate a lot. So sometimes we hear 10,000. It's another way of saying a lot, many. I think in a way, the 1,250 monks that are with the Buddha, we read in many of the preambles, and I don't know that it means exactly 1,250, or it just means that the community had grown and there were a lot of them. So the Buddha is there on Gritakuta Peak. He has an audience. We're told of who the audience is. And the setting is there for the teaching. The next part of the preambles says all of those bhikshus, all of those monks were arhats. Arhats, of course, are often integrated in Buddhist texts. You don't want to be an arhat. That means when you die, you go to nirvana. And you want to be a bodhisattva, so you don't want that. However, this text tells us something which I think we should take quite seriously. That the whole audience listening to the Buddha were arhats, except we're going to hear of an exception. And the Buddha himself was an arhat. So that even the Mahayana, earliest Mahayana sutra perhaps, tells us that in the opening, that it was taught to a group of arhats. You'd think that would be strange because that meant that they themselves could never achieve the status of a bodhisattva. That is, they will at death go on to nirvana. They have no other option. They have already achieved a state which guarantees that. So we have to, I think, often reappraise the role of the arhat, particularly in China. And we need to figure out why it was that the people who listened first to the Prajnaparamita were those who technically could not follow its example of being bodhisattvas. And yet, as we know, you go to most Chinese Buddhist monasteries, Korean, you'll find special places, special halls dedicated to the arhats. Shilai Temple here in California. In their garden, they have a wonderful display of fountains, and in the fountain and the water being the flowing water, they have the 18 arhats. Sometimes they're 18, sometimes 16. And then finally, when after the nirvana of the Buddha, there were 500 that had to gather and decide, what did the Buddha teach and what has he left behind for us? Different numbers of arhats. In this case, 1,250. These arhats, and then I'm going to read, I retranslated the following section in a way that was not done by Kwanzaa when he translated the Sanskrit. He took all of the phrases that follow this to be a list of things which arhats have achieved. I don't think he was correct. I think he missed the point that, in fact, what follows are, in a sense, full sentences, verses, if you will, which tell us something about the arhats, not just a listing of a number of achievements. So all were arhats. The first sentence, who had stopped the sensory flood. I've translated sensory flood. You'll often see it translated as outflows. And I guarantee it's very hard to get anybody who knows what that means on the basis of the English word. What's flowing out? And some people have translated it inflows. I think if you look at the Buddhist texts, that they describe sensory data as a flood. The sensory data floods our brain all the time. The sensory data can overwhelm us in this flood. And so I've started to translate it sensory flood, ashrava, rather than outflow. Then the next. Kwanzaa took the next sentence to be 3 different achievements of an arhat. 1, they were like a trained elephant. 2, they had done what was to be done. And 3, they had laid down the heavy burden. But if you look through the Buddhist text, you see that this is not 3 different things as such, but is actually a fairly common sentence that has occurred in a number of texts. That is, the arhats were like trained elephant kings who, having done their day's work, having done what was to be done, they put down their heavy burden, the logs. This was a metaphor. The bhikkhus are like trained elephants. That means these bhikkhus were meditators. They were in training. they had been trained in the art of meditation. And when they had achieved their state of awareness, insight, enlightenment, then they could put down their heavy burden. And what was their heavy burden? Their heavy burden was the skandhas, that is, the elements of human experience: form, perception, naming, consciousness. They had simply, with the stoppage of the sensory flood, they had laid down these heavy burdens that we all carry all the time. We carry our sensory flood. We carry our human experience in all its elements. And so I have translated it that these arhats were just like this elephant that you see. All day long, all their life, they have to work. But when the time comes, when their work is done, they can lay down this heavy burden when they have achieved a state of enlightenment. Then the next. Konza took this as two. They had reached their own betterment, and they had broken the bonds of existence. But I think it's a verse and a sentence. By achieving their own benefit, it meant that in doing that, they could break their ties to existence and the desire to exist. It's hard to give up on existence, as we know. And here is these arhats. When they had done what really was to their benefit, to achieve a state of enlightenment, their bond to existence had gone. And that's why, of course, they're ready to go on to nirvana. The next, continuing with what goes on with these arhats, their next was two things in Konza. They had the release of right wisdom, and their minds had attained self-mastery. I think it's a verse, goes together. Since they were released, they had achieved freedom by virtue of their wisdom. It allowed their minds to attain self-mastery. They were able to control the sensory flood and to stop it. This image, by the way, I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a most remarkable one. This is a mummy, a mummified monk who just is well preserved, looks like a living person sitting there. Speaking of self-mastery, I have always felt this one had enormous self-mastery. Then we come to the final thing. This group of 1,250 were all these arhats that I have described, but with the only exception being Ananda. Ananda is the one who's telling us what was said. Ananda was the close relative of the Buddha. Some people said Ananda was so busy taking care of the Buddha that he never had time to meditate and to achieve enlightened state. People criticized Ananda. They said, why didn't he tell the Buddha not to die? He could have done that. Why did he encourage the Buddha to let women become part of the order? He didn't have to do that. But I love this image from Gandhara. As people criticized Ananda and said, he isn't an arhat. He hasn't achieved all these things. He's just like a servant. The Buddha was sitting in a cave. Ananda was outside, and the Buddha reaches magically through the wall of the cave and comforts Ananda. And in a sense, I think, says, thank you. You gave yourself to me. And he comforts him. And of course, Ananda does achieve the state of being an arhat. And he joins the 500 when they sit down, because the 500 have to depend on him. Only he was with the Buddha all the time. If anybody heard what the Buddha was saying, it was him. So they weren't saying, when we sit down, we need you there to tell us what you heard. So then the Buddha turns to Subhuti. And this is the big shock. What in the world does it mean that the Buddha would turn to all of those bhikkhus, 1,250, and out of them all, he picks Subhuti, a monk who is only mentioned in the Pali a couple of times as either one who is foremost living in the wilderness, or he's the foremost of those who dwell in peace. But he turns to Subhuti, and the surprise is he's teaching about wisdom. So you would think that he would turn to Shariputra. Shariputra is the famous disciple. He's the one who is wise. So why didn't the Buddha, when he's talking about wisdom, the perfection of wisdom, why didn't he turn to Shariputra? Instead, he turns to this marginally known monk and says, Subhuti, you rejoice in teaching, which means you're good at teaching. So I want you to teach the Bodhisattvas. For the first time, we hear the idea that this sutra is to teach Bodhisattvas. You're good at teaching, Subhuti, so will you come and teach the Bodhisattvas the perfection of wisdom that they should accomplish? As I say, this was an enormous shock. Shariputra himself sits there and thinks, wait a minute, who is this Subhuti to be called ahead of me? Is he going to teach by what he knows, by his own power, or is he just simply teaching something which is dependent on the Buddha's spiritual power? This is set the motion in motion, the Prajnaparamita. We see where it was said to begin. We see who was there. We see this surprising event, and we are now prepared as we go forward to hear what it is that Subhuti is going to say, as opposed to what maybe Shariputra would have said. So the preamble is a way of trying to set the scene for what was taught. And now as we enter the text itself, we are shocked to find out that we are moving into an area in which a little-known monk is called upon to teach the bodhisattvas. And who the bodhisattvas were is still to be determined, but to teach them what it is that they should learn, what it is that's important about the perfection of wisdom. So we'll continue this in our next lecture. Thank you all very much.